Egyptians have started voting in the first phase of the country's parliamentary election. It's the first vote since Egypt's parliament was dissolved in 2012. But several parties are boycotting the poll. Ben Clark has more.
It's been a long-awaited election, but Egyptians have now started voting in the first phase of parliamentary polls. Over 55 million people will be choosing their representatives for 596 seats. Egypt has dozens of political parties, but most of them are boycotting the election because they believe most of the candidates are supporters of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi.
I can clearly see from the list of candidates, no matter whether party representatives or individuals, that the new parliament will be colored with money politics. That'll be a weakness for the parliament.
President Sisi denies those accusations and has asked his countrymen to come out and vote.
I call on all of you, men and women, young and elderly, farmers and workers, from across the country, assemble for the sake of the country and celebrate choosing your representatives and choose well.
Sisi overthrew Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, in 2013 after months of protests. He then banned Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood movement and imprisoned thousands of his supporters.
After what we have been through, we have to all come down here and unite. Even if we disagree, we can't disagree over Egypt.
After years of unrest, following the ousting of Mubarak in 2011, many Egyptians are hoping the elections will bring stability. But the absence of a real opposition has reduced the enthusiasm of many. Ben Clark, TRT World.
Well, Steve Mclnerney joins us live now from Washington, D.C. He is the executive director for the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me start, please, with a general question and just ask how significant these elections really are. Are they democratic, or is this basically a return to Mubarak-era voting?
Well, I wouldn't regard the elections as democratic, and they're not generally viewed that way. It is essentially a return to Mubarak era in which there is a parliament, there are elections, but the candidates that are allowed to run in the elections are overwhelmingly supportive of the president, of President Sisi and his allies, in which there's no real opportunity for opposition in the country to organize, to campaign, or to compete. As was noted, many parties are boycotting these elections, and of course, Egypt currently has more than 40,000 political prisoners in jail. There are also many other Egyptians that have fled the country to avoid persecution and imprisonment. So this is far from a free or fair environment, and I couldn't call these elections democratic. Having said that, it is still somewhat significant that we're returning from an era of more than 3 years in which there's been no parliament whatsoever to now an era more like what we had under Mubarak, in which there is a very weak parliament that's likely to be subservient to the president.
So really, voter turnout will essentially say it all, with most projections saying participation will be disturbingly low. But let me ask, what might a result in favor of continuing Sisi's rule mean for both the Egyptian economy and for the youth that are so desperate to see greater inclusion?
Well, the reality is that there's not much uncertainty about what the results will be. This is not like the elections in 2011 or 2012, in which Egyptian voters had real choices about their leaders and about the direction of their country. Regardless of the outcome of this election, President Sisi will continue down the path he's been taking Egypt. And frankly, I think that's a quite troubling path, both for Egyptians and their economy in the medium to long term, as well as especially for the younger generation. What we've seen is President Sisi increasingly reliant on outside support to keep the economy from collapsing, especially support from the Gulf countries, and that support is likely not sustainable indefinitely. What we have not seen is any real fundamental changes to the economy, including the kind of economic reforms that would open up Egypt's economy and provide opportunities for Egypt's very large young population.
Now, obviously, the Muslim Brotherhood will not be participating in this election as it's been banned by the state. But how much support still is there for the movement?
Well, it's clear that there's some support. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood is a movement with deep roots in Egyptian society. It's impossible to gauge, you know, very reliably in such a closed environment in which Egyptians can't express themselves clearly and publicly, including in public opinion polls. Having said that, I would estimate, you know, that the Muslim Brotherhood is probably supported by somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of the population, which in a country as large as Egypt is quite a large number of people.